Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. Today is a very special bonus episode. I'm really excited about this episode. As you might know, if you follow the podcast and listen to me when you see me, wherever you find me, you'll know that I'm all about amplifying voices. We need to make sure that we hear from everybody on everything. I love doing interviews. I love reading and understanding the issues from various perspectives. And I love engaging people who are committed to doing this environmental justice work. Whenever I get a chance to meet someone who's doing that, I want to make sure they have an opportunity to share what they're doing on this platform, on this podcast, or wherever I can, to make sure somebody hears from them, because their voices matter just as much as mine does on this podcast. And so I was very fortunate because a few months ago, I got an email from Laina and Eva. They are students at Laurel School in Ohio. It's an all-girls high school. Amazing students, amazing people there. And they've had their first environmental justice semester at this school. And so when they were describing it to me, it was just fascinating. They have this house where they go to off in the woods. They're thinking about different environmental justice issues in their communities throughout Cleveland, Ohio. They're looking at different solutions to those concerns and those issues. They work together as groups to think through projects and ways and initiatives to engage the issues and the people who are impacted by those issues. And I was just amazed to hear about what they're doing at this school. And if you read their website, they will tell you that this semester, this environmental justice semester, is geared towards empowering young women to educate themselves and others about the impending climate crisis and equitable solutions to make powerful strides within the community to confront social and environmental injustice. And I said, oh, you got to get on this podcast. I need to hear from you and what you're doing, because that's just phenomenal. The mission of Laurel School is to inspire each girl to fulfill her promise and to better the world. Look, this is not a Laurel School commercial. They're not paying me to say this. I'm just looking at their website, looking at their Instagram page, talking to these young ladies, and I'm feeling that we need more of these types of semesters and educational opportunities for high school students across the country. I think this could be a great model for how we engage the younger generation and bring them into and hear from them and to allow their energy and their ideas to influence where environmental justice is headed and what we should be concerned about. The teacher, her name is Angela Yeager. She does amazing work. She wrote a grant, received funding to start this program at Laurel School to do this semester, which I think will be continuing on. And I'm hoping to interview her one day on the podcast and get her perspective and to understand how she came up with these ideas and how she put it all together. And hopefully she can help us and other educators bring it to our schools and our campuses. That's in the future. Hopefully, if you're listening, Angela, we would love to have you on the podcast. And so I was fortunate. I got this email from Laina and Eva, and I spoke to them and I said, listen, whatever we can do to get your voice heard on the podcast, I'm more than willing to do that. I can't wait to hear what you've been doing and what you're working on and what's happening. And so they sent me their own podcast episode where they interviewed the founder of Redhouse Studio. Redhouse Studio is this group, this organization that is working on sustainable green architecture. They use fungi and mushrooms and different nature-based solutions to dealing with housing and planning issues throughout different communities. And they're looking into how housing is an environmental justice issue, which it absolutely is. And so these young ladies did an apprenticeship with this organization. They learned a lot, had a lot of experiences, and they delivered to me an interview that they did with the founder of this organization. They asked amazing questions about what they're doing, what kind of impact it's having. They work on their own definitions and understandings of environmental justice in their context. And it was just a really refreshing episode to listen to, because it's good to hear young people engaged in these issues, talking to people who are on the ground working on these issues and seeing things differently and understanding things differently because of what they're experiencing. And so I'm really excited to bring this episode to you. I hope you enjoy it. And I hope to one day get these ladies on the podcast so I can talk to them directly about what their experiences were like during that semester, what they've learned, what they can teach us, and how we can think through things and see things the way that they're seeing them through their young eyes, with their energy and their perspective, as we continue to push towards bringing environmental justice wherever we are. So without any further ado, you're about to hear Laina and Eva interview the founder of Redhouse Studio and share with us what they've learned and experienced through their time working with that organization. And I am very excited to share this with you. I hope you enjoy it. This is the Environmental Justice Lab.
And I'm Laina, and we are students at Laurel School's first ever Environmental Justice Semester in Cleveland, Ohio.
The Environmental Justice Semester that we are a part of is similar to a semester abroad in college, except we are in the woods of Cleveland, Ohio, where we learn through an interdisciplinary curriculum about prominent environmental issues in our community and beyond.
As a part of our curriculum, we are partnered with community organizations dedicated to environmental justice who are making a difference locally and beyond.
Redhouse is a company that manufactures building materials out of mycelia, the roots of mushrooms. While Redhouse has done extensive work in Namibia, in southern Africa, Laina and I have been learning about their upcoming local project, Biocycler, which is based in Cleveland.
Biocycler is working on remediating lead-affected communities in Cleveland by creating mycelium blocks out of lead and lead-ridden materials. This process makes the lead traced within the original homes biologically unavailable and safe for building.
For the past 2 months, we've been learning about Redhouse's missions and working with them to get their incredible story out into the world.
We are here today with Redhouse founder Chris Maurer.
Hi Chris, we're so excited to have you here on our episode.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Redhouse?
Sure. So Redhouse is an architecture studio. We're based in Cleveland, Ohio. And the red for Redhouse stands for research, equity, and design. And so we try and have all of those three facets in our projects as much as possible. It doesn't always happen, but with the projects we feel are the most meaningful, we do all three. So we do some research work. We're involved with institutions like MIT and NASA and Stanford, Johns Hopkins, etc. And we're developing some building materials that actually use the growth of organisms in the manufacture, and we call these biomaterials.
When you say you can use the mycelium, the fungal organism that produces mushrooms, to create housing materials, how would you explain how the mycelium works? What does it look like?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I'm glad you phrased it that way, because a lot of times people are saying, oh, you're making houses out of mushrooms. That's cool. Is that like the Smurfs? And no, we have to correct them that the mushrooms that we're creating in Africa are for food. So we're growing mushrooms, and the process for doing that is actually cultivating the mycelium. As I mentioned, the mycelium is actually the organism, and the mushrooms are the fruit. So to grow oranges, you would have to grow an orange tree, or grow apples, you grow an apple tree, and then you harvest the apples. The same thing with mushrooms. But the process for cultivating mycelium is much quicker, fortunately for us. And the process goes like this. We take the sawdust from the bush, it's chipped up into small bits, and then we pasteurize that. We put it through a steam treatment, kind of like a rice cooker. which makes it available. It basically kills all the organisms that are already living on that woody material. And then in a laboratory type environment with clean air being pumped in and all of our workers wearing gloves and masks, we add a little bit of the mycelium organism, which is kind of like a white, fluffy, hair-like organism. It comes from a spore, basically, and these very furry like strands come jutting out of that. And so that's why people think they're kind of like roots, right? Because they're stringy like roots, but it almost looks a little bit more like fur than it does anything else. But these mycelia can grow really quickly on that pasteurized substrate and totally colonize a bag full of sawdust within a couple weeks, such that it starts to grow mushrooms. So these root-like strands, these hyphae as they're called, grow through that organism. They externally excrete enzymes, so they're digesting their material externally a little bit, like because we have enzymes inside of our stomach, and that's how we break down food. The fungi actually secrete the enzymes externally. They break down their food, and then they pull that into their organism. So they're going to convert this woody mass into this fungal mass. And again, it's this branching hyphae of hairy-like strands, white hairy-like strands that are binding together this material. So as it's growing, it's going from a bag of sawdust into a slightly white-colored bag of sawdust, and then a much thicker glow of white to it. And then eventually, it's totally consumed by this fungal mass, this white material that is kind of encapsulating all of the sawdust and creating a dense matrix that is the three-dimensional matrix of this mycelium that is grabbing these little bits of sawdust and holding them together. And then the mushrooms will start growing from that. We'll poke a little hole in the bag, the mushrooms will come out, we harvest those, and then what's left inside of the bag, that white material that's now fungi and plant together, is what we put into a press, and then we press that into a material that's roughly as strong as a concrete block. So this is 100% waste material from the mushroom cultivation process, and we can convert that into a block for making materials. So that's how we do it in Africa. The proposal for BioCycler is a little different, where we're only growing the mycelium. We're not actually even going to grow mushrooms because those mushrooms could have the contaminants from the built environment in them. So we don't want to introduce that into the food chain, obviously. The mycelium, what it does is it can't break down some of the heavy metals, but what it can do is chelate them or kind of render them inert. And so if you've ever known anybody that's dealt with lead poisoning, they go through chelation therapy. And what happens there is you take some medicine and it goes into your bloodstream and it scavenges the heavy metals and attaches to them and makes it so that they don't stay in the bloodstream and they can't get lodged in the bone. What they do is they get passed through the urinary tract. So that's, kind of the system that we're talking about. But we want to do that before the materials are ingested. And this mycelium has different biochemicals that it can secrete, just like the enzymes, that can latch onto those. And if they were somehow ingested, down the line, for whatever reason, then they wouldn't be biologically available. They would just pass through whatever organism ate it. And that includes things like vermin that sometimes, termites, if they were to eat something and then a bird eats the termite and, up and up and up, and I don't know why she swallowed the fly kind of thing. All of those, that goes up the food chain in a certain way, and that's what we want to try and avoid.
Now, you don't hear the words mycelium-based biomaterials every day. Could you explain how these materials are engineered and what the process is in making your products safe and environmentally friendly?
Sure. Yeah, mycelium-based biomaterials is quite a mouthful. So we usually just call them bioterials, or in the case of the mycelium materials, mycoterials, because myco comes from the study, mycology is the study of fungi, and mycelium is basically fungi. And in this case, we're able to use that fungal organism to reconstitute waste material normally, usually waste material anyway, to reconstitute that into new materials. And in the case of our work in Africa, we're taking a waste bush that's encroaching the landscape there and causing desertification. And we're using that as the fodder for growing both mushrooms and building materials. So we take the waste from the mushroom cultivation to make the building materials. As you mentioned, the biocycler, we're looking at taking construction and demolition waste. And that's, basically when you demolish a home, all of that waste has to go to landfill. And when it's in landfill, it can potentially poison the environment there. But also it's going to lead to greenhouse gases because of the decay of that matter underground releases things like carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. So if we can divert that from landfills and in the same instance remediate the stuff that's in that to create new materials, then we're getting kind of a two birds for one stone kind of scenario. We get a doubling of effect because we're diverting that waste, we're recycling that waste, we're renewing it, turning it into something else, but we're also treating that waste where normally that material just goes to landfill and poisons the earth.
Wow, that's so cool.
So what role do you see sustainable architecture and biomaterials playing in addressing climate change and environmental challenges now and in the coming years?
I think there's a large amount of architects and designers that are trying to proliferate technologies that are storing carbon because buildings are responsible for 40% of the world's carbon emissions. So that's pretty much that's most of it. If you look at it, it's not most of it, but it's almost half of the world's carbon emissions. And people think of transportation as a huge thing. Of course, manufacturing is, but part of that manufacturing is for buildings. The extraction of raw resources actually is one of the biggest things that go into the carbon footprint of buildings. And if we can use circular economy, I think that's going to make a big change. Right. So there are lots of folks that are really looking into that at this point. There needs to be more impetus for this. And I think, the writing's on the wall, people just aren't reading it just yet. But as it becomes more and more mandated, as it becomes more and more necessary, as we see the environment change, then we're going to start to see a paradigm shift, I think, in architecture where we're going to leverage architecture to store carbon rather than to be this huge emissions generation.
Right, that's amazing.
So you mentioned the term circular economy. Could you touch a little bit more on what that is and how Redhouse can implements or contributes to a circular economy?
Right. So with most of our work, we are looking at circular resources. That's stuff that's usually deemed waste material, and puts that into the raw input into the manufacturing process. So if it's circular, it's coming from the cradle or cradle to grave, and then the grave back into the cradle. So it's recycling in a sense. So we're using circular economy in just about all of our projects right now. The project in Namibia where we're taking the encroacher bush, that's a waste material. So the government wants to sustainably harvest a fair amount of that bush so that it doesn't lead to desertification. And now they have a whole lot of this bush that they need to use for things, right? And so most people are looking at that and saying, well, it's a bush, I can burn it. That's probably the best use for this. And we're saying, well, you could also make food out of this, and you can make building materials out of this. And maybe that's a better outlet for this bush. So it's a circular resource that, otherwise would go to burning for fuel generation or creating charcoal for cooking, those types of things. But then we're diverting it from that and putting it into food and housing.
Yeah.
With the biocycler, the circular part of that is pretty, fairly obvious, where we're talking about taking literal demolition waste or waste that comes from the construction site, chipping that into the raw material for cultivating fungi. But instead of doing mushrooms and building materials, we're doing remediative services and building materials.
Yeah.
And so it's helping a lot of people, as well as just being environmentally friendly. Mm-hmm. It's helping neighborhoods and helping people to have safe housing.
Yeah, exactly. And working with you, we've had great opportunities and we've learned so much. Everything that you're just saying, and we've been able to immerse ourselves hands-on in your lab, and it's been such an amazing opportunity. with that, we attended the NASA's Bioscene conference with you. And in that, there was a sustainable architecture who was talking about the struggle to convince their clients to invest in sustainable implements into their designs. What challenges have you faced in implementing sustainable designs and construction methods, and how have you overcome them?
Thank you. I've also enjoyed working with you all, and it was great that you all could come out to the Bioscene 2023. Just a little bit about that. That's NASA's Biomimicry Summit. They host it every year. I've met some of my best collaborators at that conference, and really recommend your listeners to look into that. But so the panel on architecture, I don't think architecture is necessarily different in this sense. I would say that most professional services, when they're trying to get clients to work on environmental goals, they have to fit it into kind of the bottom line of their clients' needs. And so I think the architect that was talking about his experience with that, he mentioned that he had to make the sustainability part of his design do more than just be sustainable. It had to do several things, and so there's a process in architecture called value engineering that's really a euphemism for cost cutting, and that usually happens towards the end of the project when your client has realized they can't have everything they want for nothing, so they have to pay for the things that they've included into the project. And if your sustainability strategy of this is instrumental in the design, is totally embedded in the design, that would cause the project to have to go kind of back to square one, then that kind of saves it from that cost-cutting block. He also pointed out, and this is true about almost all of the sustainability tactics, is it really brought down their life cycle costs. So, by implementing things like energy efficiency and design of buildings that can passively guard against energy loss, then you look at the cost, the upfront cost is minimal compared to the usage cost of it, because you can bring down those utility bills. In a lot of cases, you can actually prove that you bring down sick days that your employees have, because there's a thing called sick building syndrome, where people in certain buildings, because of the way that they're built, causes people to get sick. And it's also, they want to work in a more pleasant environment, so they're more apt to call off work if they're, if they don't enjoy their workspace. I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Like, something that's not talked about a lot is how we can incorporate sustainability into also making super cool designs. We talk about that a lot in environmental justice, and how being sustainable you don't have to cut down on the beautiful things in your life. And so what's one piece of advice you would give to growing developers and architects to encourage adapting sustainable and green business models?
Well, I think one of the themes that all of these questions have contained, I think, is the theme of biomimicry. So we're always using inspiration from nature, and even the bioperformative aspects of nature with our mycotecture, right? Because we're literally using fungi to do what fungi do, which is to recycle things. They turn dead matter into living matter. They turn leaves into the forest floor, which then kind of recycles and regenerates and rejuvenates the world. So and then of course, we were talking about the Biomimicry Summit. There are all sorts of engineers and designers and scientists that are really looking into what nature does, and that's what biomimicry is in a nutshell. Is looking to how nature solves problems and learning from that to solve the problems you have at hand. And so I would encourage people to look into biomimicry, to ask nature, to find out what natural organisms do. That's 3 billion, 4 billion years of evolutionary tinkering that kind of come to solutions that are incredibly complex and efficient and work within the environment. They're by nature adaptive to what's what nature requires.
Yeah. That's amazing. Like, it's been so amazing to have this opportunity to learn a completely different sphere of architecture.
Yeah.
Because we talk about a lot too how in schools you don't learn about this. Like, you don't learn about how there's so much you can do with science, and you can collaborate it within different fields of study like architecture. And it's just been so cool to be able to see as girls, like, because I think a lot of girls drop out of STEM because they're not interested in it or it doesn't appeal to them. And it's been so interesting to be able to see what you can do with science.
I think also what we were saying earlier about the circular economy and the idea of cradle to cradle, I think it truly starts with using materials that are sustainable, rather than like trying to find ways to clean up the mess that you've made, starting with preventative measures of using materials that are like safer for the environment, and start off with that mindset.
Yes.
Chris, is there anything else you want to share about Redhouse or just sustainable architecture?
Well, at Redhouse, we're working on several biomanufacturing processes and kind of spin out companies that are coming from this. There's the one I've already mentioned, Mycohab, where we're turning Namibian encroacher bush into food and housing. That is a company that we co-founded with folks at MIT and Standard Bank Group, which is Africa's largest bank. Started off as a research project to prove that we could do this. And as we have proven it, we're now in the process of converting that to a company and building that up. And so we're currently working in Namibia, but we're looking at South Africa, Guinea, Nigeria, other countries. In 2025, so fairly soon. The biocycler is something that we hope we can proliferate here in Cleveland, Ohio, and that's where we're trying to create remediative justice by converting construction and demolition waste that prominently or most proportionately affect communities of color, and convert those into sustainable homes and healthy homes. And then the third project we're working with NASA, and we're trying to develop buildings that actually can grow themselves off planet. So the reason for doing that is because to go off planet costs a lot of money for every pound you take. It could be as much as $1 million to take a single pound to Mars. Obviously, you don't want to take concrete blocks and steel beams and things like that to build with. So what NASA is looking to do for the most part is in situ resource utilization, or use what you have when you have there. So an in situ resource is a resource that would be found on Mars, for instance. And so we've developed a way that you can take a really small inflatable package that has some biology preceded into it, and then match it with the water and carbon dioxide and nutrients that you find at destination to grow first autotrophic organisms and then mycelial mass to kind of combine that into something that becomes truly effective at thermal insulation and radiation shielding. So those are our three main projects. But I also wanted to say, in going back to the biocycler and the idea of environmental justice, and what you just mentioned about getting young women into STEM, is that we're finding that architecture and biology, those are great intersections for enticing young women to come into the field. What we do see a very big lack in is in design and architecture, is to get minorities into the field. So I would encourage your listeners to to take a closer look at that, to encourage folks that may not see their place necessarily in architecture and not see the proper amount of role models in architecture, but encourage communities of color to engage with that, because there is a lot of opportunity, especially when it comes to environmental justice.
So we know that environmental work cannot be done alone. So who does Redhouse work with?
Thank you for asking that. That's a really important part of our work. We really value our partnerships. Everyone from NASA and MIT with our research projects. But when it comes to environmental justice, we have some really brilliant partners as well. Especially with the biocycler, we're working with the Black Environmental Leaders Association here based in Cleveland, Ohio, and some of their association members, which include collective citizens organized against lead. Robin Brown is the executive director for that. She's been working at the grassroots level for a long time here in Cleveland to educate people about the dangers of lead in the environment and advocate for those that have been affected by it. We're also working with Jennifer Lumpkin that is involved with, I don't know how many organizations, but one of her main ones is My Grow Connect, and that organization is mostly concerned with creating food sovereignty in urban environments. So she's an urban farmer, among many other things, and an activist and an organizer. And her processes are basically, fighting what is referred to as food apartheid, where certain communities don't have the same access to food resources and healthy food resources. That is, it used to be called food deserts, right? But if you're really looking at what's going on here, it's more of an apartheid where certain communities are not having the same access to healthy foods. And so urban farming is one of the solutions for that, but also developing markets in settings that are considered food deserts. And so that work really ties into our work with food and housing at the same time. And of course, Robin's work is really on point with the work that we're trying to do with remediation and building materials.
Last but not least, a final question to end with. What is environmental justice to you?
Thank you. That's a very important question, and I'll probably have to think about it a little bit. But I think the definition for environmental justice is that all people should have equal access to the environment, and should it should basically be a level playing field that folks have within the environment. I think that the better way to really understand it is environmental injustice. And so that's probably a little easier to understand. And, the reason why we need to focus on environmental justice is because historically and even presently, that's not the case. There are communities that are more affected by the environmental toxins that have come into the environment. Communities of color are disproportionately affected by, the decades or centuries or even millennia of racist practices in city planning, in banking practices, and in industrial practices that kind of put them in harm's way. And so we see scenarios now that communities of color have much higher incidences of asthma because of the air they breathe, because they're closer to pollution. They have much higher incidences of lead poisoning, which is one that is something that we're really concerned with. And a city like Cleveland, which is predominantly black city, we have 4 times the national incidences of lead poisoning as the rest of the country, and it's worse here than it is in Flint, Michigan. And Flint, Michigan was famously thrust into the spotlight with the water supply being tainted with lead. And here it's not necessarily the water that's doing it. It's actually people's homes that are doing it, and that's almost scarier to me, I think, because there are ways of going around and getting different sources of water. It's not easy, obviously, but once water's the problem, then you can deal with it. If the danger is in your home, that becomes something that's really, really scary. So to see the environmental injustice, I think, is something that makes us all want to strive for that environmental justice, or getting folks to the same opportunities, even though historically they've been disadvantaged. I would like to throw that back to you and ask you what environmental justice is.
Thank you for that question. For me, I think the issue of environmental justice, you can't think about it without understanding that every single issue that we face is intersectional. And so for me, environmental justice as a topic is understanding that, like you said, certain communities are disproportionately affected by the environmental issues we face. And when we start to make those solutions, we have to involve every community that's been affected by them, and specifically those that have been more negatively affected by those environmental issues because of race, because of socioeconomic status. So I think Redhouse is a perfect example of what environmental justice means to me, because Redhouse, specifically in your Biocycler project, is involving Black communities and communities who actually live in Cleveland to the table that is thinking about solutions. And I think that is a key example of how racial inequity, class inequity, and environmental inequity come together and then are finding equitable solutions by inviting every voice to the table.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you guys have said. And I think another thing with that is making sure that the education is there, because I know that I personally was raised in a public school district that really just taught us how environmental justice was just, save the trees, where it's so much more than that. And making sure that kids are raised to know that there's an environment where people are not healthy and they are struggling within their own homes and within their own environment. And we just need to have education worldwide that teaches that and teaches that there are solutions and ways that you can alter your life to help people.
With so much climate doom and growing anxiety about preventing further damage to our environment, it's essential and so empowering to hear from community members striving to work at solutions. Thank you, Chris, for coming on this podcast and offering your wisdom for a sustainable future in architecture.
If you would like to know more about Redhouse, you can visit their website at www.redhousestudio.net. Thank you, Environmental Justice Lab, for allowing us to share our voices. If you would like to know more about Laurel School's Environmental Justice Semester or apply, you can visit www.laurelschool.com/EJ. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Laina and Eva, for that interview. I appreciate your hard work on the episode. And like they said, if you want to learn more about the Laurel School and about their EJ semester, I'll put the links in the description of this episode. And that is our show. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.